Herzlich willkommen zu einer weiteren Folge des Deloitte Future Talk, dem Podcast rund um Zukunftsthemen, die uns alle betreffen. Und heute geht es um nichts Geringeres als die Zukunft von Europa.
Deloitte Future Talk. Innovation. Transformation. Leadership. Disruption. Growth. Let's talk about the future.
Hallo liebe Podcast-Freunde. In unserer heutigen Folge sprechen wir mit dem ehemaligen Präsidenten des Europäischen Rates, Herman Van Rompuy. Und es geht natürlich sehr viel um das Thema Europa. Herman Van Rompuy war vor kurzem in der Schweiz und wir haben die Chance wahrgenommen, ihn zu interviewen. Er ist ein Vollblutpolitiker, das wirst du im Gespräch wirklich gut spüren können. Er hat es ja in seinem Heimatland Belgien bis zum Ministerpräsidenten geschafft, ehe er dann für 2 Amtszeiten der erste Präsident des Europäischen Rates war, ehe dann 2014 der frühere polnische Ministerpräsident Donald Tusk seine Position übernommen hatte. Was erfahrt ihr alles in diesem Gespräch? Wir diskutieren, ob die EU-Expansion der letzten Jahre zu schnell und zu weit ging, wie Europa auf zunehmende Anti-Immigrationstendenzen reagieren sollte. Wir wollen von ihm wissen, ob denn in seinen Augen die Euro-Krise schon gelöst ist. Wir sprechen über den Brexit und wie es hier weitergehen soll. Wir wollen wissen, ob denn Europa ein Führungs- oder ein Demokratiedefizit hat oder vielleicht sogar beides. Und aus Schweizer Sicht besonders interessant, wie sieht denn das aktuelle Verhältnis der EU zur Schweiz aus? Das Gespräch wurde auf Englisch geführt und mein Kollege Matt Peters hat Herrn Van Rompuy interviewt. Ich wünsche euch nun viel Spaß bei dem Gespräch.
Mr Van Rompuy, many thanks for taking the time to join us today. First, I'd like to explore a little bit about you and to introduce you to our listeners. Politics, poetry or rock and roll?
Politics, rock and roll and poetry. Rock and roll, I think Wikipedia exaggerate my interest in rock and roll. I was a fan of Elvis Presley, but that's it. Poetry is something else. Poetry was part of my life all the time. I myself am now a haiku poet, and haiku is a Japanese form of poetry, very brief, 17 syllables, 5-7-5. And there you have to express a feeling, an emotion related to nature, to seasons. And you need at the end, in 5 syllables, a paradoxical statement, so that the reader is surprised, make him thinking. And that's the real difficulty for a haiku poem. I published 2 books on it, but poetry is completely different compared to politics, of course. But each of us has different compartments in his character, in his personality. And poetry is part of it, and politics also. There are links, but not too much. It's just simply 2 parts of your own personality. That's it.
You studied philosophy and economics. What made you step into politics, though?
I never stepped in politics. I was born in politics. I never did something else than politics. I was interested in politics when I was very, very young, 9 years, 10 years old, reading papers, listening to the radio at that time. There was no television. And then I started very, very early. I was 16. I was still in secondary school when I founded the local section of the Young Christian Democrats. And it never stopped. It never stopped. So I was all my life in politics. So I cannot say who is what inspired you. I was not inspired. I was born. So it had more to do with genes, I think, than with something else.
Brilliant. Well, just on that sort of question of inspiration, who has inspired you in your life and career?
There, I would say the first real inspiration, if there was an inspiration, because I repeat it, I had already an interest before I found this man that inspired me, the first who did was John Fitzgerald Kennedy. At that time, it was 1960. We were 12, 13 years old. He appeared to be an idealist. Afterwards, it was not so clear. He was a Catholic. He had very generous ideas about the Peace Corps, about being at the service of your country. I learned his inauguratory speech when he became president by heart. I can still quote passages of that speech. When you compare to the speech that Mr. Trump made when he became president, there's no comparison at all. So this was really a source of inspiration. And later on in my own country, I was inspired by late Prime Minister Tindemans, who was also famous in the European context because he wrote a famous report, the so-called Tindemans report, and there for the very first time the word European Union was used. I became his collaborator in his cabinet, and we remained close friends, as I can call it in that way, until he died 2 years ago. For me, he was really a source of inspiration. Later on, I had also what I call masters in politics, people that I know well, and I learned a lot of them, but their names don't matter. There's one who I wanted to mention, that is again a late Prime Minister, although he died rather young, Jean-Luc Dehaene, Prime Minister of Belgium, and most likely the best Prime Minister we had in the post-war period, and the best President of the European Commission the Commission never had. Unfortunately, he was blocked in 1994 by Britain in the race to become President of the European Commission. We were also very, very close, and he was a bright man, a well-balanced judgment. And when I had to become Prime Minister, I hesitated because I said at that time, I never can it as well as he did. And so it made me hesitating to become Prime Minister. Finally, I became Prime Minister, and I forgot all my hesitations afterwards.
What was the feeling when you actually got that call to be asked to be Prime Minister?
Yeah, but you have to see this in the context of a career. When I was a young man, people told me, one day you will become Prime Minister. So for me it was some kind of, it sounds pretentious, but some kind of natural destination. The only thing that made it less natural was that I hesitated twice. In 1994, precisely when Jean-Luc Dehaene could have become President of the Commission, I had to succeed him as Prime Minister. And at that time, I didn't feel sufficiently ready, mature for assuming that task. Belgium is a very difficult country to rule. And so I was hesitating, but Jean-Luc didn't become President of the Commission, so I stayed in his government without being Prime Minister, and I was happy. And then in 2008, it was very obvious that I had to become Prime Minister, but even at that time, I tried to convince Dehaene to do the job again. But for him, the time was over. He had left the premiership 10 years earlier, and so I had to do it. I refused until the king asked me, and he started a long speech, King Albert, because at that time it was King Albert. He started a long speech and said, Sire, don't push it, I accept.
So what is it actually like to take on the role of being Prime Minister of a country like Belgium, and how does that compare to being the President of the European Council?
First of all, when you are Prime Minister, you are elected, directly elected, not as a Prime Minister, but as a parliamentarian, and you are accountable to the Parliament and to the public. So the link between premiership and public opinion in your own country is very, very strong and very direct. When you become President of the European Council, you are appointed, elected by 27 colleagues, heads of state and government. So there is that relationship with the public is further away. Of course, you are a public figure, so you are explaining the decisions and defending the decisions of the European Council, but you are not elected by the people. That makes a lot of difference. Of course, in the daily practice, a Prime Minister in Belgium has to deal with those two communities, Dutch-speaking, French-speaking, with at least 4 parties in a coalition, because we always have coalition governments. And this is an excellent preparation for the European Council. You have, of course, 28 countries, but you are used to deal with many parties, with many governments. As a Belgian Prime Minister, you are used to do so. And this helps a lot. When you come from a country with a one-party government, then it's something completely different. For a Belgian politician, I think it's also the case for a Dutch, even for a German one, we know that we have to deal all the time. We can have our own opinion, we belong to a party, but there are 2, 3, 4 others who also have their opinion. So we have to listen to them and to find a common denominator. You have to find a compromise. You have to find an agreement. And again, it is an excellent preparation for becoming President of the European Council. As a leader of a coalition, you have no arrogance at all. You can't be pretentious. You have always to be open. And for me, the transition was quite easy.
And I suppose sort of something that characterises your style in that time was being not particularly flamboyant, not really attention-seeking, power-hungry wasn't really your style. Was that your personality, or is that really a tactic that you tried to build that consensus?
As always, it is a mix. Of course, I was ambitious, and at that time, I was ambitious from the start on in my career, and I was ambitious also when I became President of the European Council. You never forget that. You never reach that kind of position without being ambitious. It's as simple as that, and you have to be very honest on this. But at the same time, I knew that you need compromises. And you know that if you try to put your ego in the first place above the 28 egos, members of the European Council, you will never succeed. You will never succeed. So you have to be more discreet when you assume that kind of function, because all the prime ministers and presidents, of course, they were and they are ambitious. They have their own ego, and they want to be respected as such. And the most important thing for getting decisions, for achieving a consensus, is to have their trusts. They have to trust you, and you have to trust them. And then you can achieve something. Of course, there's always the substance. There is the difficulty that you have to overcome, the technical solutions you have to find. But without trust, it never works. It never works. So in some way, you have to put your ego aside for doing a good job as President of the European Council. And try to find common positions and common solutions. If you make declarations as President of the European Council all the time on how you see things, then at the end of the day, you have to find a compromise with your own positions of what you said in public, and a compromise also with what the others want. And that's one difficulty too much. So I skipped in public what my position was, and I focused on the internal discussion, so that at the end of the day I come with an outcome and with the results. I often said to my colleagues, I will not be judged later on the number of interviews I gave. I will be judged on the results we together got. And that will remain. All the rest will be very easily forgotten. Vanity is always short-term. You have to focus on the longer term and at the same time on your own legacy. In the time 2010, 2015, we had in the first 3 years one objective: to save the Eurozone, and by saving the Eurozone, saving the European Union, and by saving the European Union, saving the biggest peace project ever in the long history of the European continent. And that was our task, and we succeeded. We succeeded. And that will remain, that kind of success. All the rest will be forgotten.
So you just mentioned there that you orchestrated the response to the Eurozone crisis, and that was the biggest challenge of the time. What we're seeing now in the European Union is multiple crises coming from all different angles. How do you think that would compare? How would you handle that differently if there was multiple crises coming at the same time as the Eurozone crisis?
Yeah, I cannot say something about something that didn't happen. But let's first define what multiple crisis was. It was a succession of crises. We had the banking crisis, we had the Eurozone crisis, we had the refugee crisis, we had Brexit, and in the meantime, of course, we had also unemployment and the economic crisis. In my time in office, as I said, we had the focus on the Eurozone. My successor had to deal with, first of all, the refugee crisis, which is a different crisis compared to the Eurozone. Different and, in my view, more difficult. Why? Because it's about human beings. The Eurozone crisis was also about human beings, but indirectly it was about the prosperity of people and the jobs of people. But it was indirectly. In the refugees, you have to do with, first of all, refugees, people fleeing their country, taking huge risks on their own lives even. Some drowned in the Mediterranean, thousands drowned in the Mediterranean. And people also here fearing a loss of identity, rightly or wrongly. So the human factor is of extreme importance, was of extreme importance in the refugee crisis. And that makes that kind of crisis much more difficult to handle than the Eurozone crisis. Brexit was something else. Brexit was a decision taken by the British people on an initiative by the British government. It was not the fault of the EU institutions. We had to deal with it afterwards. We are negotiating Brexit because you cannot leave the European Union on your own. In the treaties, is foreseen that you have to negotiate your exit. Otherwise, you are even violating international law. But, of course, this crisis is different from compared to the refugees and to the Eurozone crisis for this specific reasons, that it was an initiative taken outside the European institutions and outside even the 27 countries.
Do you think the EU has lost the sight of its noble aim of securing peace?
We have peace. We have peace in the European Union. Let's not forget that we are surrounded by war. We still have a war in Ukraine. 10,000 people died. Already now, there is since 2 years some kind of ceasefire, but the war is not over. And this is in our eastern neighborhood. In our southern neighborhood, there is the war in Syria. 350,000 people already killed. And it is a neighbor. When you are in Cyprus, member of the European Union, you can even see, so to speak, the coast of Syria. So this is very, very close. So they are really neighbors. So we are surrounded by war, but the European Union is an island of peace. We had a war 20 years ago on the European continent, in former Yugoslavia, in the Western Balkans. And those countries, all of them, want to become member of the European Union because they are really convinced that if they don't belong to the European family, all of them, then war, sooner or later, can recommence. And that's why Slovenia is already a member state. Croatia is a member state. Serbia is not only a candidate country, we are negotiating with Serbia, as we are negotiating with that other small country, Montenegro. But each of those countries are really, really convinced that what can bind them is this belonging to the European family and to the European Union. Of course, they have to meet all the criteria, and it will take for some of them years before they are ready to join us. But sooner or later, most of them, if not all, will join us to keep peace. And if there are threats in the world now, threats of war, it's more in Asia than in Europe. In the long history of mankind, it was always in Europe. And in this terrible 20th century, the 2 world wars started in Europe. That's over now. Nobody can imagine that members of the European Union are waging war among themselves. So we turn the page of history. When I look again to Asia, between Japan and China, there is no reconciliation. Between France and Germany, there's a reconciliation since the beginning of the 50s, a few years after the end of World War II. So there's a huge difference, and that is a lasting achievement of the European Union.
There's a number of points there where you touched on about expansion of Europe. And I just wonder whether we could explore, how far will Europe expand? And what do you think the future of Europe will actually look like?
If you had asked that question, let's say 30 years ago, and somebody would have answered you, one day, Romania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, the Baltic states will become a member of the European Union. Nobody would have believed you. Nobody. It is the case. My successor comes from Poland. A little bit more than 20 years ago, Poland was a communist state. Now he is the leader of the fatherland of democracy, because that's the European Union. So very difficult for me to predict the future. But let's say that in thinking in terms of membership, of course, the Western Balkans is sooner or later belong to the European Union, and some countries are already members of the European Union. Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, it's less clear, because there a lot of work has to be done. Those countries are not ready at all to join the European Union. We have with them association agreements, so they are close to our heart, and we have strong links or working on strong links economically and in many other domains with them. But it is really too soon to say if and when they will join the European Union. But one thing is for sure, they don't want to belong to the former world, the world of yesterday, the world of the Soviet Union and its successors. They feel European. They feel European. And we'll see what the future brings. But I'm certain that they will keep their European aspirations. And if they work hard, we have not to exclude that sooner or later they will join our family, but it's too soon to say something meaningful about it.
I suppose when we look at Europe, one of the questions that I sort of wonder about is, are we facing a leadership deficit or a democratic deficit? And, does the EU need to reform, and how should that happen?
Yeah. We are facing some kind of democratic deficit. And we are facing some kind of leadership deficit. I will explain myself. I am not convinced that we have to change many procedures in the European Union. We have a double legitimacy. The European Parliament is directly elected. Of course, the participation rate is not that high, but it is comparable to, for instance, the United States, and nobody is telling us that the United States is not a democracy. And the other part of the legitimacy is, of course, the member states, national democracies. Each of the prime ministers or the presidents is elected by the people. So we have this intergovernmental democracy, and you have this community-based democracy symbolized by the European Parliament. So I don't think that we need a lot of changes in this system. But the problem is the following, that if democracies, national democracies and European democracies, cannot deliver on the main concerns of people, concerns of prosperity, jobs, security, fairness, then they will not consider anymore democracy as bringing sufficient added value. And you see that in the Western world as a whole, democracy is losing legitimacy because people are telling us that the outcome of our policies are not responding to their expectations and not focused on their real worries. And I repeat, prosperity, security, and inequality are their main concerns. So we have to deliver. We have a delivery gap. And when we have outcomes on these three domains, then we can reconcile citizens much more with national and European democracies. So I will translate it in another language. We need a output democracy. I don't think that we have big problems with our input democracy, with the procedures, the way we are electing our politicians. But we have to deliver. That's the main problem. The leadership deficit, yes, we need it because we need to go beyond the short term. And we need leadership, leaders taking risks and not being sure that they will be rewarded in a few years' time or rewarded in the next elections. We had much more political courage than most people thought. I know leaders who took decisions on unpopular measures, knowing that it will cost their political life, and so it happened. But in this juncture, we need a European leadership. And I hope that France and Germany and the leaders of the EU institutions will assume that role. Most of the time in Europe we take decisions in a period of crisis, with the back against the wall, with a knife under our throat. And then we take decisions. Now we have not that kind of crisis. And still we need to strengthen the Eurozone. We have to work on much more security and asylum and migration policies, on European defense, on the fight against terrorism. We need also to fight against tax dumping, against social dumping, against commercial dumping, what people feel as unfair today. So, but there is no crisis mode. There is no feeling of urgency. And that's why the leaders have to say, look, we are not in a crisis, but still we think that we have to do those things. In a crisis, you can accept people much more easily unpopular measures. It's much more difficult when you are in a business as usual climate. And so leadership is absolutely needed now to think at the longer term. Because sooner or later, a crisis will happen. A crisis economically or financially. We don't know when, we don't know what kind of crisis, but a crisis will happen. Is the Eurozone, is the Economic and Monetary Union ready to face that crisis? We did a lot already to strengthen the Eurozone, to make it more solid, but it's not enough. So we have to anticipate this. And in the as far as refugees and migration is concerned, look, Africa has now 1 billion inhabitants. By the end of this century, there will be 4 billion. So there's a huge potential of migration. So we have to anticipate. We need a long-term policy, developing Africa and protecting better our external borders. That's the kind of leadership we need today. I am convinced that we will have that leadership, even if it is not always so visible today, but we'll have that kind of leadership.
You mentioned a lot about crises and what is there. How do we get better at predicting those crises that are going to hit the EU?
Yeah, expect the unexpected. In the banking crisis, of course, there were prophets who said, look, if things are going on as we are doing now, we will just go through the wall. And they predicted a future crisis, but there was a tiny minority. Most of the people thought, even economists, that there were not major problems until the unexpected happened. the banking crisis. We were on a few millimeters away from an implosion of the world financial system. And nobody saw it, almost nobody saw this really coming. The Eurozone crisis was a big surprise. I took office the 1st of December 2009. And we were not prepared to the Greek crisis. If you had said to me the 1st of December, look, in 2 months' time, Greek will have no access anymore to financial markets, not only me, but many experts, even at the highest level, would have said, no, this will not happen. This will not happen. Greece has problems, but not to that extent. So we expect the unexpected. Of course, Brexit, the referendum was a surprise, the outcome. As many people said about the American elections, it was also a surprise. So if you ask me what are the things to come, I don't know. There are also happy surprises. Because 6 months ago, a lot of people said to me, look, in France, Marine Le Pen has really a chance to become president of the Republic. And in the Netherlands, the biggest and the strongest party will be the far right. And I said at that time, it will never happen. But I was considered as somebody who said strange things. Because there was some kind of common understanding that it could happen. I was convinced that it never would happen. So there are also positive surprises. So don't ask me too much about what will happen. But according to the information we have, and as far as we can see, we have to prepare the future. And I will not repeat what I just said. And this is really what we expect from our leaders. Of course, when a crisis happens, we have to deal with it. But we have to prepare future crises, even if we don't know what the precise nature of this future crisis will be and when it will happen. But with the information we now have, we have to anticipate as much as possible.
So picking up on the Brexit point that you brought up there, you once said every country should emerge victorious from negotiations. A negotiation that ends with a defeated party is never a good negotiation. Given this context, what's your thought on Brexit right now?
Yeah, I still think that we can have a deal on the separation, because that's the first thing to do. And the separation, that means a deal on the status of EU citizens living in Britain, 3.5 million, or British citizens living on the European continent, more than 1 million. I think we can have a solution satisfactory for both parties. It's about people. It's about people. I think you can have an agreement on the divorce bill, so to speak. If you look objectively to the figures and to the commitments made in the past, legal and political commitments, I think common sense can here also prevail. If you start saying that is my figure, then of course if it is 2 billion more, then you are considered as a loser. We have to agree on the methodology, and then at the end, if we agree on this, at the end the result will be a result in terms of billions of euros. But here also, if we put aside slogans and prejudices, and if we are not obsessed by figures, by what we committed together in the times that we all were members of the European Union, I think we can find a solution. On the Irish border, the final solution can only be found when we know in what kind of free trade agreement we will have. So we will not have the full solution in the separation treaty. But I'm convinced that we can find a solution on the separation. I'm convinced that we can find also a solution on the transition. The transition will be very close to the status quo. But if it is for 20 months or 2 years, that's not the problem. Those who are really in favor of Brexit, for them it is a long-term option, and those 2 years will not make the difference. So here also, I think with common sense and having a long-term perspective, we can overcome the problems. From the European side, you have to realize, we have to acknowledge that we are not open or we're not ready to punish Britain. But at the same time, we cannot give a premium for leaving the European Union. So from the European side, it's a balance that we have to make. And from the British side, they know that on the short term, there is a price to pay. For them, I don't believe it, but for them, this price is not incomparable to the long-term benefits for Britain. So they also have to make that kind of calculation and to find the right balance between short-term and long-term. But I'm convinced that we can find a solution. The big problem, according to my view, because you can say I belong to the EU 27, that's true, but the big problem is not only a British problem, there's a problem inside the Conservative Party. And if the unity of the Conservative Party is more important than the interest of the country, then I'm worried. But if they put the interests of the country above the interest of the party, then I'm much more confident.
There are a number of similarities and differences between Switzerland and Belgium. What do you think are the core values that the countries share?
First of all, we are two countries, and we are still united. It's less evident for Belgium than for Switzerland. But let's look around us. Czechoslovakia fell apart. Cyprus is a divided island. In Northern Ireland, you had even a civil war. So living together with two communities, 2 or 3 communities, is always difficult. It's a challenge. But Switzerland succeeded brilliantly. And Belgium succeeded also. Met more difficulties because we have another history. But we succeeded. There is no violence in Belgium. No violence at all. We are in a constant diplomatic movement of dialogue, of talking to each other to find common solutions, even if it takes time, even if it takes 541 days for forming a federal government. At the end, we had an outcome. And we have, since then, we have we have stable governments, and we have even a separatist party who is now a member of the federal government. So we show the capacity to overcome problems, and that we have in common. We succeeded in reconciling different cultures, different languages. And a federal solution in both countries is a template for many other countries. A real federalism. I'm convinced that in Spain, when they would have had for quite some time, a real federal system with this constant dialogue between the federal power and the regions, a lot of problems would have been avoided. So federalism is a solution of a answer to a multipolar society or a multipolar country.
What do you think the EU's view of Switzerland is?
Of course, Switzerland made a choice, and we have to respect that choice, not becoming a member of the European Union. You can deplore that choice, but it's a fact of life. So what we try to do, Switzerland and the European Union, is giving this strong will of the population not to belong to the European Union, to come as close as possible together. That's why Switzerland is, via more than 100 bilateral agreements, part of our single market. Not in all domains, but in most of them. That's why Switzerland is part of the Schengen zone. That's why Switzerland share with us this free movement of people. That's why we are so close in terms of trade. In terms of trade, the EU and Switzerland are very, very close. I think that Switzerland is the third trading partner of the European Union. And of course, this belonging to a large extent to the single market is the main reason for all this. So we come as close as possible together. We can do more. We can do more still in other domains. But it depends, of course, on the will of the Swiss people. I think there is a lot of readiness in the European Union to go further in the cooperation, but it needs to tango. And in the meantime, let's make the best of it, respecting what was agreed in the past, working on streamlining the access to the single market. The bilateral agreements are complicated. We made proposals to have another institutional framework for it. I call it streamlining of it. We are negotiating. We are not there yet, but we are still negotiating on it. So let's improve what we have, and let's see in the future what we can do more in the field of cooperation. Geographically, of course, Switzerland is in the heart of Europe, and for the very far future, the younger generation, who has to decide what their place is vis-à-vis the European Union and in the European family.
Thinking for the final question a little bit about thoughts and predictions for the future. Who's going to win, Belgium or Switzerland, in the next football match?
We have the best team we ever had in Belgium. All those players are playing in the Premier League, in Britain or in France or in Germany, and in each of their clubs they belong to the best. When they are in the national team, they are not at the level of what they are performing in their clubs, but the day will come that they will be as good in their national team as they are performing in their clubs, and then we are unbeatable, but we are not there yet.
Well, thank you very much today for this interview. Lots of optimism, lots of looking forward to the future, and thank you once again for your time.
Thank you.
Vielen Dank, dass du wieder dabei warst. Ich hoffe, du hast diese Folge des Deloitte Future Talk genauso genossen wie ich. Wenn dir die Folge gefallen hat, leite sie doch bitte weiter an deine Freunde oder Geschäftskollegen. Und was ganz wichtig ist, abonniere diesen Podcast, denn dann verpasst du auch keine Folge mehr. Du kannst dies auf iTunes, Soundcloud und Stitcher tun. Details und Links dazu findest du in den Shownotes. Das sind die schriftlichen Informationen bei jeder Episode, beispielsweise auf iTunes. Dort gibt es auch noch tolle zusätzliche Informationen, Hintergrundwissen rund um das heutige Thema. Und wenn dir der Podcast allgemein gefallen hat, dann nimm dir doch bitte auch 1 Minute deiner Zeit und bewerte ihn. Das kannst du zum Beispiel auch auf iTunes machen. Einen Link dazu findest du ebenfalls in den Shownotes. Mich interessiert natürlich auch dein persönliches Feedback und auch deine Anregungen, denn nur so wissen wir, wie wir den Podcast noch interessanter gestalten können. Geh dafür am besten auf unsere Website www.deloitte.ch oder kontaktiere mich auch direkt auf meinem LinkedIn-Profil. Ich wünsche dir jetzt noch einen schönen Tag, eine erfolgreiche Woche. Bis zum nächsten Mal.